You know that one episode of Community where Abed essentially has a mental breakdown because he couldn't figure out whether Nic Cage is a good actor? I admittedly love that episode, but the ground on which it stands is absolutely ludicrous. Not only would I say that Nicolas Cage is a good actor, Nicolas Kim Coppola is one of the premier thespians of the past 3 decades, a position that he was destined to achieve from birth, as if Zeus himself came down from his throne on Mount Olympus and had sex with Marlon Brando to create the acting demigod that is. Why do I say this? Because Nicolas Cage is literally every actor ever compactly fit into 3 non-bite sized packages. And after this video, you won't be able to disagree, as you will agree with me, or you'll mysteriously suffer a catastrophic event parallel to Dave Chappelle's in Con Air, the single greatest movie ever released into the world, starring the one, the only
Nicolas freaking Cage, okay? Oh, yeah! Oh, yeah! Oh! Oh! Oh, I'm a cat. I'm a sexy cat. Oh! 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 Oh!
I'm not sure if you heard me earlier, but Nicolas Cage is in fact Nicolas Coppola, the nephew of the guy that made Bram Stoker's Dracula and the chick from Rocky, the cousin of the coyote from Fantastic Mr. Fox, and also the cousin of the star of The Godfather Part 3, literally the only reason that movie's even watchable. Beyond his direct family descent, Nicolas Cage is of German and Italian ancestry. Aside from the whole Nazi and being the actual real-life villains of the early 20th century thing, Germans have been pretty cool. So let's go ahead and add a point to that tally of greatness. Then we have the Italian part. Now some might say what I'm about to venture here is a stretch. Now we all know that Italy once for a very brief period of time occupied Ethiopia before getting their fettuccine eating asses kicked out. No offense meant to fettuccine. So all Italians are essentially Ethiopian, and Ethiopia is, from my understanding, the birthplace of humanity. Garden of Eden, yeah, I once heard it was in Ethiopia. If you're not into the whole religion thing, Lucy, oh, holy fucking shit. Yep, oh my, yeah, Ethiopia. So, Nic Cage is directly tied to the first humans, making him us and making us him. So as I said earlier, about Nic Cage being everything and everyone and everything is Nicolas Cage. We are Nicolas Cage and Nic Cage is we. Thus, Nic Cage is the ultimate actor's actor, aka the true thespian. Thespian, in the Oxford English Dictionary, defined as a true motherfucking actor. One who is the character, not the character who is one. Nicolas Cage said himself that he prefers to be called a thespian because he doesn't like the connotation around an actor being someone who lies to the audience by tricking them to believe they are a character. Rather, he is someone who reaches deep into his heart to make himself the figure that he's portraying. After he said this, a lot of people were calling him egotistical, which, what person in Hollywood isn't, but really I think that by the definition of thespian that he is abiding by, he's absolutely right. Nicolas Cage is an actor who never abandons Nicolas Cage. In the best way possible, Cage rarely loses himself in a role. He makes himself the character rather than becoming the character, if that makes sense. Nic Cage is always Nic Caging, but I think a lot of people mistake the fact that he never truly loses track of himself in the character as being bad acting, when I really think it's the exact opposite, or at least like a 160-degree turn. I think it's a bit of a feat to be able to become a character while also being yourself, and looking at a lot of the roles that Cage chooses or gets chosen for, it's important that he is acting the way he is for the films to work. Now, to look a bit more into what I'm saying here, let's compare one of Nic's performances with a performance from an actor that is almost the exact opposite of him in Daniel Day-Lewis. Lewis is the prototypical method actor who always loses himself in whatever role that he is taken on at the moment. He chooses his roles sparsely and with precision, as opposed to Cage, who is consistently in multiple movies a year. So it's kind of difficult to find a role similar enough to compare between the two, because sure, they've both made movies in similar genres and have worked with some of the same or at least similar directors, but their polar opposite approaches make it hard to directly compare a lot of their movies. So I decided to look at the biopics in each of their filmographies to see how each actor approaches portraying a real life character. Admittedly, two very different real life characters, but real characters nonetheless. Interestingly, even the characters that they're portraying say so much about the individual actors. Lewis is a grand figure, so who else would he portray but Abraham Lincoln himself? As for Cage, as I said, a lot of his acting comes from an intrinsic quality in him to be able to portray characters while still being himself, so he plays Yuri Orlov, a Russian-American arms dealer who embodies a lot of the characteristics and mannerisms that Nic Cage has. Looking at these two portrayals, they are night and day, quite literally. Lewis wins an Oscar for literally becoming a figure that was so grand that many actors wouldn't even dare attempt to approach it, and Cage is powerful in a role fit for somebody who has the same charm, confidence, and ego that a lot of actors have, but very few could have pulled off. Lewis is, as aforementioned, a method actor who caught pneumonia refusing to wear a coat on the sets of Gangs of New York and made everyone call him Mr. President on the set of Lincoln. From the limited amount of acting experience that I have, it seems that the key to acting is to convince yourself that you're not lying, and each actor has their own way of getting into their own head and doing that. For Lewis, it's a matter of fully becoming the character to the point where nobody, not even himself, thinks otherwise. And I think that as an audience, we are more keen to praise this method of acting because of its on-the-nose demeanor. For Cage though, he calls himself a nouveau shamanist, or somebody who tries to augment their imagination to get the performance without feeling like they themselves are faking it. This admittedly feels like a bit of pulling from a certain body part, but I can kinda get where Cage is coming from. From my perspective, Cage is a master of adding the personality of a character to his own personality in order to immerse himself into a role, and while this might be mistaken for laziness at some points, I think that it has lended to some all-time great performances. The main reason as to why some consider Nic a bad actor, or at least they have a dilemma as to whether he's a good actor, pertains to his overall body of work, which is understandably extremely confusing to an untrained mind, but not me, for I have lived with Nic Cage, metaphorically, for well over 20 years now. Yes, even in the womb, Nic Cage and I had a connection, and I think that I understand it all. Unlike all of these so-called great actors who make all these great movies until they're around 40 or 50 and then fall off the map, Nic Cage understands that the true body of work needs a bit of that up and down at all times. Whereas the De Niros and Pacinos and Hankses and Washingtons of the world make all these Oscar-winning, life-changing movies for years and years before turning to the paychecks, Nicolas Coppola Cage knows to make a few paycheck movies in between the masterpieces, and even then he himself has those peak years to be compared with almost any other peak. To show you what the ideal filmography of an actor is, I decided to hop on my Jimmy High Roller She and make a few graphs with the combined IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, and Letterboxd scores and box office of each movie. Well, most movies Nic Cage is starred in, because, well, this is the main reason I made the video. I wanted to make this graph. After watching Unbearable Weight, I went back through Cage's filmography, and yes, there are these shite movies, but who doesn't have those? And aside from the paycheck movies, he has an outright impressive body of work. We're gonna start in 1983 with Valley Girl because he's in Fast Times for like 2 seconds, but from 1983 till now, Cage, who I've established as at least being a kinda good actor, has some of the highest highs that an actor could have. Sure, obscure body of work, I'll give that to you, but what else for such an obscure performer? Nic is prolific, and let's just go through these graphs to prove it. Starting off with the first 10 years of Nic's career, he has an unarguably great start. Some of this might have been due to nepotism, but nonetheless he took advantage and made some classic flicks and some underrated gems. Genuinely, I don't think there's a single bad performance in his first cluster of gigs, and for reference I would say that an aggregate rating of 5.5 or above is passable. Anything above a 6 is good or fun. Above a 7 is what most consider to be a great movie, and those 8s and higher are game changers. For the 8 movies I found notable enough to include, the average score is a 7.19, which is very solid. In this stretch he starred in Moonstruck and Raising Arizona, 2 of the best performances of his career. He also was in Red Rock West, Wild at Heart, and Vampire's Kiss, which I consider to be genuinely good movies, and at the very least most can agree that Cage is doing something good in each of these films. The only quote-unquote passable films here are Honeymoon in Vegas, in which Cage is in a supporting role, and Vampire's Kiss, which stars a much, let's go with, zanier Cage. A great start to a prolific career. Now these next few years are what some might call the golden years. Sure, from 83 to 93 Cage was making great movies and even got a Golden Globe nomination, but as you probably saw, his movies aside from Moonstruck weren't what we would call box office hits. This time I want to specify the 4-year run Cage had from 95 to 99, because this 4-year run is just absolutely insane. The first 4 of these movies are possibly the weirdest but coolest of any career that I can think of, because he first makes Leaving Las Vegas, which is a movie that genuinely broke me. I think it is unarguably his acting magnum opus, and for that he won the Oscar for Best Actor. This movie was also surprisingly a bit of a hit, making $50 million, and it was critically acclaimed. So how does Nic Cage follow probably the peak of his acting, oh my bad, thespian career? He goes on the all-time 3-movie blockbuster run of The Rock, Con Air, and Face Off. Who else would do this? Nic Cage is just built different. For the remainder of this one, he essentially just does the reverse, making some more action movies before working with Scorsese on Bringing Out the Dead. The average score of the movies that he made throughout this span is at 6.6, so not too much of a dip from before, but now Nic Cage went from making an average of $28 million a movie, which is pretty solid, to firstly making The Rock, which made $336 million worldwide, compared to the combined $272 million worldwide that his previous 9 movies had made. And moreover, overall, the movies in this stretch averaged $158 million at the box office, making Nic Cage one of the biggest stars in the world. For the next 2 years, Cage did ride on the coattails of the previous 4-year stretch, making 4 okay box office hits with Gone in 60 Seconds, Captain Corelli's Mandolin, Wind Talkers, and The Family Man. Now, from 2002 to 2012 is the era in which I think many people separate their Cage opinions, because he made a lot of bad movies during this era. Most people probably think of this era as a quantity over quality thing, but it just isn't that simple, at least for me, because Cage unarguably made a lot of good movies in this stretch. Adaptation and Oscar nominee Kickoff 2002, he follows that up with Matchstick Men, which is one of those movies that did good in the moment but hasn't lived on in the public conscience, even though it's a really solid flick. This is also the National Treasure era. Lord of War came during this stretch, and so did Kick-Ass. Now, all of these movies are good in my opinion, and they all have a good Nic Cage performance in them, and looking at this I realized that a lot of people are probably knocking Cage for working so much. If those movies that I had just named, along with 1 or 2 others, were the only movies he made during this 10-year stretch, I'm sure he would be looked upon in a higher realm, at least in the popular perception. And this is a bit of a dilemma, because yes, I don't think he should be demonized for working so much. He probably needed to at this period in time. However, there's also something about actors like Leo and Pitt who choose their roles so precisely that makes them more beloved in the public conscious, and also just makes each performance feel like it weighs more. So there is a bit of yin and yang here, where yes, he has probably given us just as many great performances as of late as most other top tier actors have, but it's really just up to you how much you want to detriment him for making 2 bad paycheck films and 1 good fun film each year, rather than just giving us the latter. The average for this period is a 5.13, which is being heavily carried by those movies I mentioned earlier, and the average box office is still pretty high at $130 million per movie. Now, for the last 10-year stretch, I know I said that the previous stretch was where most people split. This is probably when a lot of people just wholly gave up on the man. Justified or not, that's for you to decide. Box office wise, Cage movies are still technically making a solid $58.6 million each, but that includes the standouts like Spider-Verse and The Croods. So without those 3 franchise fares, Cage movies are making an astounding $3.7 million at the box office over the past 10 years. Remember, the previous years were $130 million a movie. The era before that was $158 million a movie. And the first era, when people didn't even know who Nicolas Cage was still a solid $28 million a movie. But has he truly fallen off like these statistics suggest? Well, not really. His average rating for a movie is about a 5.3, and once again, this era just falls into the same dilemma as the last. Each year he gives us about one really solid film with a genuinely good performance, but there are about 2 mid to genuinely garbage movies accompanying it. Once again, it's up to you how you want to perceive this. Personally, I don't think that his reputation should suffer. I know which movies are which, and it's a matter of personal choice which ones you want to watch. He still gives us the quality, just sucks that there are a few not so quality coming along with him. Recently, Nic Cage starred in one of the better comedy movies of the year, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. In the movie, Nic Cage plays, well, himself. And this prompted me to go back through his entire filmography, and man, oh man, what a body of work it is. He's been a part of some of the best movies of all time, and admittedly some of the worst, and also everything imaginable in between. Nicolas has been in darn near 100 films since his debut in 1982's Fast Time at Ridgemont High, and in the majority of this vast filmography, Nicolas Cage is doing something interesting. Good depends, but always interesting. I think some of the negative stigma around Nic Cage as an actor has to do with the inconsistent variety within his work. To many, it is easy to categorize an actor as good just based on their filmography and the type of movies they make, and to many this should be the only criteria. The Leo and Lewis types choose their films carefully and can be said to make them more critic-friendly fare, not to imply that their movies aren't also beloved by the public. Almost all their movies are quality and come few and far between. The Rocks and Jason Stathams of the world make mindless blockbuster action hits. Most wouldn't say that they're great actors, but they're definitely great at what they do. And for most of the great actors, these personas can be split throughout a career. De Niro only made high art Oscar fare early on, then he turned to a lot more of the guaranteed hits later in his career, with a few exceptions. Most actors can be categorized, but Nicolas Cage truly can't. He's been a part of and led blockbusters, high art, low art, the good, the bad, and the mid. Nic Cage has done it all, and while I can understand this blurring whether he's a good actor for most, for me it's a no-brainer.
Ahmed, think of something safe like Holly Hunter or Don Cheadle. Ahmed? Ahmed?
That was brilliant.